Good morning. And it really is morning. It's exactly 4 o'clock. I didn't sleep. I've been up since maybe 1 o'clock, something like that. Tried to sit there for an hour and decided to get up. When I was Matthew Franklin Whittier, I had the same problem. So some of his health problems have come right on through, stomach problems, insomnia, things like that. And seemingly, the more I delve into his life, the more his uh, com- particular complaints come through. So anyway, if I hesitate or seem a little bit spaced out, it's because I haven't had much sleep. I want to take you on a little journey here by sharing yet another relic with you. And this is something I saw on eBay. It's a check. I'm gonna cut it in editing also. This is a check to John Greenleaf Whittier. It is dated January 15th, 1867. It's for $500. Now, in 1867, according to the inflation calculator I just used online, $500 in 1867 was the equivalent of $9,390.90 last year in 2020. So this is a pretty big check. This was a royalty advance for his most famous work, the poem Snowbound. But what's interesting about this check, aside from that historical fact, is that where his name appears on the check, that's Matthew Franklin Whittier's handwriting. Now, how do I know that? Because it's bookkeeper's handwriting, and that was a known style. I forget what it was called now. How do I know? Well, I recognize it, first of all. And secondly, I compared it with a whole bunch of examples of Matthew's signature where he writes the name Whittier. And I'm going to put them up on the screen here. We have the ones that I've shared with you, the letter from that Matthew wrote for his friend Nathan Winslow. We have his signature there as part of the text. We have his signature in that album that I shared with you. And let's see, there's a couple other examples. And then there's an older one. That has the W the same way that the check shows it, because this was his calligraphy style, so he got fancy, when he was signing that way. This particular letter came from, I think it was 1838, and he was writing to someone in Michigan hoping to relocate out there, so he was introducing himself. By the way, you'll see in that signature that he spells his name with one T, Matthew, which is why I use it that way. I started out with the usual spelling and switched over when I found that particular letter. Now, that means that Matthew was working for the publisher. The publisher for Snowbound was Ticknor and Fields. And that means that Matthew was working freelancing as a bookkeeper, which he did. Matthew had bookkeeping skills and he had good handwriting, bookkeeper's handwriting, and he freelanced. So he was working at the Boston Custom House at that time, but he was freelancing for Ticknor and Fields. Now, Ticknor and Fields published all the major authors. Now, the poem Snowbound was about Matthew and John Greenleaf's childhood. And that has an interesting story. These are all interconnected, and I don't know in what order to bring them in. I'm a little befuddled this morning. So I have everything ready. I just don't know what order to present it in because everything's interconnected. So we'll go to Snowbound. This is a copy of Snowbound. It's not a first edition, but I do actually have one. And it's beautifully written. John Greenleaf Whittier had a real gift, amazing gift. And but this particular poem was originally started as a children's poem. And even with that aside, John Greenleaf Whittier had a tendency to paint with a kind of, I call it fairy dust, or whitewash, you could say, in a negative sense. In a positive sense, you could say that he cast a warm glow over everything, see, to make it nicer than it was. Well, the Whittier family, I found out, I knew this from my own emotions, but I was able to substantiate it. It was as dysfunctional as everybody else's family. It was not the idyllic family that he portrayed in Snowbound. So when I first got hold of this thing, I had a lot of anger at John Greenleaf Whittier, because what I felt was, I think when I died, I felt betrayed by him, as though he really wasn't the person he pretended to be. And in fact, he wasn't really the person he pretended to be, but I think it was a kind of neurosis. I think he had himself convinced that he was a model of Quaker piety, or everybody else certainly believed so, when really it was this amazing ability to throw fairy dust over everything and make everything nice. See? So anyway, I'm going to read you a little section from Snowbound. The boys are sleeping in the attic. Now, the Whittier lore tells us, as I understand, that the boys slept in the attic when there was company. But this is a blizzard. It's a blizzard, and there's holes in the walls or in the ceiling, so the snow is coming in, which means the wind is also coming in, which means those boys are up there shivering. What I remembered, and I substantiated it through some of Abby's stories, because Abby talked about Matthew's relationship with his father in her stories. So apparently he believed in toughening his boys more even than was normal in New England at the time. There was a kind of a philosophy that was going about that you should toughen up your boys, but he went overboard. So he had a sadistic streak, which is not found anywhere in Snowbound. John Greenleaf Whittier put a lot of fairy dust over that. But here they are sleeping in the attic. What I remembered and what I feel is that he punished them by having them sleep in the attic. And also I remembered being hungry. So he sent them to bed without supper and made them sleep in the attic in the middle of a snowstorm. Okay, you don't find that anywhere in the Whittier lore. So let me read this. You have to deconstruct it. And again, it's beautifully written. Within our beds a while we heard the wind that round the gables roared, with now and then a ruder shock, which made our very bedsteads rock. We heard the loosened clapboards tossed, the board nails snapping in the frost, and on us, through the unplastered wall, felt the light-sifted snowflakes fall. But sleep stole on, as sleep will do when hearts are light and life is new. Faint and more faint the murmurs grew, till in the summer land of dreams they softened to the sound of streams, low stir of leaves and dip of oars, and lapsing waves on quiet shores. Well, you can believe that if you want to, basically. So, when I first began writing my book, my first ebook, Matthew Franklin Whittier in His Own Words, and I read this, and it was very difficult for me to read that. I couldn't force myself to read the whole poem, but I did read that portion, and all of a sudden a parody came to me. I didn't know a whole lot about Matthew at that time. I knew he wrote satire, but I didn't know that he wrote poetry. He wrote a great deal of poetry, including humorous poetry. So out from the depths of myself, fully formed, came this stanza in parody of Snowbound. Now, I don't know if Matthew actually did a whole parody of Snowbound. If so, he never would have published it. He probably would have burned it, But this is what came out. This is what I wrote. Cold as shit the night it was. The fierce wind blew with shake and buzz. Gaps between the wall boards, big as quarters, bore testament to thrifty mortars, bringing in the bitter blizzard while no warmth came from empty gizzard. But see, I didn't even think about this when I wrote it. But there's some things in here. One thing is thrifty mortars, old houses. This was an old 1600s farmhouse. They were not plastered, but you could certainly plaster them later on if you wanted to, which had not been done. So again, if the snowflakes, the lightly sifted snowflakes were getting in, the wind that shook the bedpost was also getting in, right? And then the other thing was empty gizzard, which means that they were sent to bed hungry. So what's happened is that, there's skeletons in every family's closet. And when I'm researching reincarnation, I have to go with my actual feelings, which is going to be the actual situation that was there and not the nice one that's been created for history. See, it's just, and if I want to prove that my memories are correct, I have to dig into this stuff. So it's not that I set out to destroy John Greenleaf Whittier. It's just that I had to establish reality. I've got something here on my desk that I pulled out because I used my cell phone to copy some of these images, and in doing that, I had to get the cable out. And in doing that, I found this. Now, you know that Matthew was radical, political radical. Well, when I was young, I worked for McGovern, and there's my McGovern button. They're very, very valuable now. I think you can get 50 cents for one on eBay. I guess a million of them were created. But anyway, that's an original. That's from mine. I got stories I could tell you about that too. Now, so we have Matthew working as a bookkeeper, freelancing as a bookkeeper for Ticknor and Shields, which means that now you got to remember that Matthew had a long literary track record and an august literary track record. He began as a child prodigy before John Greenleaf Whittier was ever published, like 2 years before. John Greenleaf Whittier was an editor, I think, for a paper, a local paper in Haverhill, if I'm not mistaken, while Matthew was the editor, effective editor, of a New York City paper. And he would get John Greenleaf Whittier published to give him a leg up. So Matthew was the first and established, you know, in that field. Whereas if you look at the Whittier legacy, it just looks like Matthew was just a farmhand who was a hack writer, you know, who couldn't write any serious poetry or anything. It's been totally distorted. And a lot of that is because Matthew kept himself so much under wraps. But he was the real co-author of A Christmas Carol, which I'm going to be proving very soon in an article for Real Paranormal Magazine. See how I go commercial now? He was the real author of The Raven. He had been the real author of the star-signed articles that Margaret Fuller claimed, and the F-signed articles in the Dial. He had been the real author of at least 4 poems that Elizabeth Barrett Browning had published and gotten famous for. So this guy didn't just write Ethan Spike, okay, this satire that he's known for. He had as august a track record as any of the people that were publishing in Ticknor and Fields, but he was the water boy. Now, and not respected. Now, what this reminds me of is years and years ago, I worked for a public television station. This particular television station in Atlanta was operated and owned by the local school board, which was it was a black-owned station. But it was the I'll say poor redheaded stepchild, so to speak, because there was a big state-run channel in Atlanta also. So there were 2 PBS stations in Atlanta. This was the little one that was constantly struggling for money. Well, they finally brought in a board of businessmen, white corporate guys, to make this station financially viable. See, I wrote a story about this in Matthew's style, but I vividly remember there were 3 cameramen. 2 of them were black. One of them he was a really fine individual. He had wonderful character. He was a Christian, committed Christian. And he was a long-time cameraman with this station. And what they did was they demoted him to half-time, part-time cameraman, probably with no benefits. And the rest of the time he was a janitor. And this guy had complete equanimity. He ran the camera professionally. He emptied the trash with equanimity. I mean, it was humiliating, but he really had dignity, I mean, I'll never forget that. So Matthew was in a very similar situation as the bookkeeper for Ticknor and Fields, signing the checks and doing the bookkeeping for all of these famous writers, because a lot of them were represented by Ticknor and Fields. But here's the ultimate humiliation. John Greenleaf Whittier gets famous for a phony poem about their dysfunctional childhood. And Matthew writes the check. There were actually 2 checks for sale. One was to Oliver Wendell Holmes and one was to John Greenleaf Whittier. Well, I couldn't afford them both. They're very expensive. So I had to let go the one of Oliver Wendell Holmes, but that was before I knew that Matthew had been personal friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes for many years, like since 1830, when he used to also publish Oliver Wendell Holmes' poetry in that newspaper, The Constellation. Well, that's an awful lot of background. But in 1869, 2 years later, Matthew wrote an Ethan Spike story expressing his frustration with the literati, the prominent literary people in Boston, expressing his frustration that they didn't appreciate him, that they marginalized him essentially. So this is a letter from Ethan Spike he always wrote these for the Portland Transcript, which he'd been doing for many years. So he dates this letter from Boston, where he lived, May 12th, 1869. And on the top it says, "From our intelligent and reliable Boston correspondent," which you'll see he asks them to do. Now I have to read this in dialect in which I, can't imitate the accent, so I'll do the best I can. "Gents, if you'd a little liver than not, I wish you would head this thusly, quote, from our intelligent and reliable Boston correspondent," which they did. "You can help me a good deal in this way. There are everywhere vulgar minds which don't appreciate intelligence. Some of the Boston Mutual, Mootool, Mutual Admiration Society, would you believe it, don't seem to appreciate me in that character. Indeed, I don't think Boston generally is aware half the time when it entertains angels, AINGILLS. Not that I would profanely class my humble self with heavenly bodies." Now, when Matthew used this term and misspelled it, here it's spelled HEVINGLY. In the past, he got away with spelling it heavingly bodies, which was a deliberate double meaning. "Not that I would profanely class my humble self with heavenly bodies, far from it, but figuratively speaking. Now, an endorsement like which I suggest for this heading would naturally turn public attention towards me, and if you could manage to intimate that E.S. is a lively critter which allers cares his eyes in his head, and that our Boston friends had better see to the holes in their coats, for a divil of a cheel is among them taking notes," he's quoting something, "or something like that, they might perhaps be afeard if they didn't respect. I've traveled a good deal in the aristocratic quarters, and have seen a good many things there which wouldn't look pretty in print. Them high-nosed families, which has their dining rooms down cellar," apparently in Boston they had, you can walk along in the apartments and see there's windows right above the ground, and that was the cellar. Apparently people ate down there. "Don't seem to be aware that the arrangement furnishes inquiring minds, like your correspondents, an accurate knowledge of their bills of fare. I don't believe there's a native-born Bostonian knows half so much about the scrumptious parlors and drawing rooms connected with lean kitchens in this metropolium as does yours to sarve. I've got memorandum of 29 families already, which is upstairs and out of doors as serene as a June morning, but which snarls and jaws over their victuals like pigs over a scant supply of taters, and I just as lief print them notes as not. Let Alsashai, I don't know what that means, let Alsashai also understand I'm turning my attention a little to genealogy. I shall also find out all about their relations back to the 5th generation. Does A.B. number blank blank street know that I know that his great-grandmother's aunt, A.N.T., by marriage, used to sell huckleberries? But enough. If they want to buy me off, a line addressed PSLOQZY, Boston, P.O., to be left till called for, will receive prompt attention. N.B. Nota bene. Apply soon and enclose a stamp. P.S. Generally speaking, it may be mean, this Gould business, digging up the bones of past generations just to show that some of them were deformed. But intelligent correspondents must live. One of them means to anyways. If folks don't want the bones of their ancestors rattled, I can only say I'm open to compromise. A judicious outlay of Spondylix money will allers stop them rattling. Nous verani on this pint at this time. And then he goes on with some other point. So he's making fun of himself. He's poking fun and teasing the literati that don't take him seriously. He's also threatening them. And he makes good on that threat. Now, this is something I'm not prepared to really present any evidence on, but when John Greenleaf Whittier had a birthday, his 70th birthday in 1877, there was a huge, Dean Howells of Houghton put on a huge banquet for John Greenleaf Whittier. And Oliver Wendell Holmes and Longfellow and Emerson were there as the guests of honor. And Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, read aloud a story that got him in hot water because it was more bitingly satirical and it made fun of the guests of honor than his usual stuff. Well, I figured out that Matthew apparently was ghostwriting for Samuel Clemens for dinner speeches during that time. Matthew had ghostwritten for many people over the years, apparently. And Matthew had written that story. He used Clemens as a Trojan horse because he wasn't invited. See, he was not invited to this dinner, but he crashed it apparently. So if you read between the lines, especially Howell's account, what you find is that Matthew gave him this dinner speech to read, and Clemens didn't realize just how targeted and satirical it was. So he read it. He reworked it to have all West Coast slang instead of New England slang. He said it in the mining country in California instead of in New England, but the story itself was Matthew's. And it hit its mark. So Matthew apparently was there because Dean Howells, who I think Matthew really disliked, because I look at his picture and I say, man, I don't like this guy at all. So Dean Howells says that there was one man who will remain forever unnamed for no reason. He doesn't say why he doesn't name him, who was laughing hysterically. Well, that was Matthew. He was laughing at the practical joke because Matthew loved practical jokes. So that was his practical joke. And I mean, he was friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was friends with all of those guys to some extent because as the little brother, Matthew would go in the same social circles. But you know how it is. I mean, I had a friend that had a little brother. Little brother tags along, but he's not respected as an equal. So that was Matthew's situation. That's all I really wanted to share today. I think I can go on and on, but anyway, that's what this check is. This is Matthew as the water boy, as the low-level freelancing bookkeeper signing the important people's checks. It's very poignant. It's kind of funny in a way, but it's also very, very sad. I mean, I feel it. What I feel is that Matthew always believed that if he kept a virtuous anonymity and remained humble, as Abby taught him, and he learned as a Quaker, both, don't put yourself forward, just do your best and shine, where you are, and people will notice and society will come around and appreciate you, And what he found was it just didn't happen, that he kept his light hidden under a bushel, as one of his editors for the transcript told him, and he didn't sign his work, and people stole him blind. They claimed all his work, and nobody knew that he had done these things. Nobody knew that he had written The Raven or co-authored A Christmas Carol or the other ones. And they didn't respect him because all they thought was, oh, he's the author of that Ethan Spike. And they probably didn't read that carefully enough to see how brilliant that could be at times. And one of the unofficial Whittier biographers, William Sloane Kennedy, actually wrote that Matthew's Ethan Spike stories were not worth the trouble of looking up, and that they prove incontestably that there's only one genius born in a family. So this myth of John Greenleaf Whittier being great and his brother Matthew being just the little brother that tagged along as a literary hack, it got worse and worse and worse. It didn't get better. Nobody came along and questioned it. Nobody ever dug into this thing and realized, what he'd actually accomplished. So I have to do it myself. And my birthday's on Christmas. And for a long time, I've wondered, Could I possibly have arranged to be born on Christmas as a sign to myself? You know, sounds pretty far-fetched, but it's possible. You know, I don't know. I do know that my birth was delayed, and if it had not been delayed, I probably would not have been born on Christmas. But anyway, there we have it. I have a bunch of these various relics and things to share. I don't know if I have too many more that Matthew held in his own hands. I know that in my past life, in a different body, I wrote this check with a different pair of hands, you know, which I think is interesting. Oh, by the way, the monopod pole for my camera should be coming in tomorrow, Monday. And there's a big snowstorm coming in here soon, but I may be able to sneak off and do the video that I want to do in front of the house that I believe Matthew and Abby rented when they first came to Portland, in which Abby hung up the purple tapestry, silk tapestry, which I remembered, which Matthew then, after her death, must have had made into curtains, which ended up in both the Raven, in both the Raven and in Lady Geraldine's courtship. Almost identical line. Scholars haven't been able to figure out. Poe pretended that he admired Elizabeth Barrett so much that he basically stole the style of Lady Geraldine's courtship to write the Raven, and actually practically stole one of the lines. It's all BS. I'm telling you, Poe was a sociopath and he did nothing but BS. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was not a sociopath. She was neurotic, and she was a horrible liar. Poe was an excellent liar. Dickens was an excellent liar. But and Albert Pike, who I recently talked about, was even his own biographers don't quite believe him, you know. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning was an awful liar. It's really transparent. Anyway, I'm going to be reading the stanzas from those two poems in front of the house where I believe that purple cloth was originally hung by Abby. It may have some historical significance for somebody someday. I just kind of think it's cool. So that may be our next entry. We'll see when that monopod comes in and when I can get down there. And hopefully I won't be like stopped by somebody who says, "What are you doing here?" and that kind of thing. It's a matter of being prepared and parking the car and walking over and doing the thing quickly and getting out. I mean, I've done photography enough to know that you basically have to get in and get out. Because if you stand there and fumble and so on, somebody sure as heck is going to come up and confront you as to what you're doing. So we'll see how that one goes. And once again, we are, by the way, getting a few viewers. I think this one has been seen, the last one rather, has been seen 7 times, which is huge for me. 7 people have actually deigned to watch something me rambling in front of the camera. It's amazing. So we'll see if I can get that one done. I have to add a little addendum here. I'm not working from notes generally. I have my materials prepared, but I don't have an outline. So I tend to skip certain points that I had intended to touch on. When in my parody of Snowbound, I inadvertently suggested that Matthew's father was cheap, it so happens that later on I ran into some corroborating evidence in the Ethan Spike satires, inasmuch as Matthew would insert himself into those satires, which he would. So here we have from the November 19th, 1853 edition of the Portland Transcript, the editor introduces, "Our friend Ethan Spike Esquire has furnished us the following account of a trip to this city, which we hasten to lay before our readers." Of course, I'm reading this from Portland today. "Ethan," says father, says he. "What, sir?" says I. "Why," says he, "I've been a-thinking I should kinder like to see Portland again, afore, as in the natural course of human natur, I must go hence to be known nowhere," says father. This much is autobiographical, too. "Well," says I, "why don't you go and see it?" says I. "There's nothing in the Constitution agin it, I reckon." "No," says he, "I s'pose there hain't, but I thought seeing you been round and have studied human natur considerable, I should kinder like to have you go with me," says he. "Well, look here, General," says I, "if you'll pay all the bills, why, I don't care if I does." The old un, tried hard to get me to say I'd pay half, then a quarter, then half a quarter, and finally that I'd stand the horse baiting. But I told him 'twas no use. I wouldn't pay a single red. So he gin in, and away we went. So there's some evidence that I appear to have been right. Could be chance, we don't know. The other thing I wanted to mention was that in the Ethan Spike story, where Matthew says that he has ways of knowing, what the financial situation, the dire financial situation is of these famous people. Of course, he's talking about like socialites, but what he really means is the literati. And he says that he can see them, through their cellar windows, eating cheap food or whatever. Well, in reality, he was in a position to know their finances because he was the bookkeeper for their books. So he knew exactly what their financial situation was and how much they were selling and so on. So that's how Ethan Spike tied into real life. Anyway, I won't make this any longer, but thank you for watching.